We're about to start the last session of the GOED Exchange, and I think it's we're excited to bring it to you actually because obviously one of the big themes this year has been that this industry is starting to be in decline, and we face a lot of crises. Some of them generated by negative media, some of it generated by other things, and so we've designed this last session to talk about some ways that you can help manage crises for using traditional methods. How you can manage it from a scientific perspective, and then we have the last speaker, the third speaker, talking about ways, novel and innovative ways, I think, to really defend your marketplace. So I want to jump in. The first speaker is Holtz, and he's actually going to be conducting a workshop on crisis management with all of us. So it'll be, I think, a very interesting session. It's a little different from our normal talks. Shell has actually spent more than 35 years in corporate and organizational communications, and he's an expert in many areas of communication, including social media and other aspects, and we've asked him to come and conduct this crisis management workshop. So, Shell, I'll welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. It's kind of a challenge to do a workshop in 1 hour. So the way this is going to work is that I'm going to present some material, then I'm going to give you some information about a relatively current crisis that you may be aware of in the media. Some of them I think you would absolutely be aware of from media coverage, and ask you to take a couple of minutes at your tables to chat about how you would handle it if you were the organization at the heart, at the center of this crisis. And those of you who come up with some answers that excite you, we'll let you tell us what you came up with, and then we'll move on to the next section. I've got 3 of those broken out in this presentation. I do want to start off by noting that the best way to handle a crisis is not to have one. Captain Obvious tells us that, and the way you do this is by being proactive and identifying the issues that could become a crisis. James Grunig, who is very well known in public relations circles, he's out of the University of Maryland and has conducted a lot of research and is highly touted for the results that he has produced, has said that issues management is what companies do in order to keep issues from emerging into crisis. Crisis management is what organizations do when they don't practice issues management. The way to do this these days, in addition to just being aware of what's going on in your organization, is to monitor very carefully what people are saying about your organization, your products, your services, your industry. It doesn't mean that you have to go to the extent that organizations like Dell are doing. This is the social media monitoring system at Dell in Round Rock, Texas. It's a combination of many different technologies and many different sources streaming in that allow them to detect what is being said, where it's having an impact on their reputation, and they can direct that information to the right source to address it. And they've gotten very, very sophisticated in the ways that they do address those issues in order to keep them from bubbling up and becoming a crisis. The Altimeter Group did a study, and they found that the crises that erupt in the social media space, where I'm going to concentrate a lot of my remarks today, are by and large preventable. The organizations that experience these crises tend to have a lot of characteristics in common. First of all, they don't have policies that govern employee use of social media, and employees haven't been trained in how to use it. So the idea that we can bolt all the doors and lock all the windows and keep the bad stuff that's going on out there in the social space from affecting us is really kind of a bankrupt idea. We need to empower employees to represent the organization based on their areas of subject matter expertise so that they can go out and talk to the people that they are able to influence in order to keep this from rising to the level of a crisis. The level of crisis that the Altimeter Group was looking at were the ones that actually had an impact on the organization's financial bottom line. But here's what Dr. Grunig said. When conflict occurs, public make an issue out of the problem. Organizations use the process of issues management to anticipate issues and resolve conflict before the public makes it an issue. Organizations that wait for issues to occur before that end up doing crisis communication. So what is a crisis exactly? I am going to argue, and I take a lot of heat for this, there are people who disagree with me, that an emergency is not a crisis. If you work for an airline and a plane crashes, that's a lot of terrible things. That's an emergency and that's a tragedy. The reason it's not a crisis is because you can anticipate it. You usually have a playbook that you pull down off the shelf and you know exactly what you're going to do. A crisis is something that's unexpected, that leaves you wondering, how are we going to handle this? What are we going to do about this? We don't have experience with this. We don't have a process that we can kick into gear. We are frozen in panic and fear. And organizations that freeze in panic and fear in a crisis tend to revert to some very bad behaviors. The most important thing that your organization can do in a crisis is to adhere to its values. Probably the most famous example of effective crisis communication, and it's one that has gotten better and better in the perception that we have of this crisis over the years since the mid-'80s when it happened, is Tylenol with the product tampering in Chicago. It's not actually as rosy as a lot of people paint it today, but the primary thing they did that led to people remembering that as a great example of crisis management is that the leadership of the organization knew that their values started with patients first. And they stuck to that. They didn't revert to a shareholders first mentality. What we really need to do is protect sales. So they, having never faced product tampering before, nobody had at that point, not to this degree where people were dying, made the decision to withdraw product nationwide, not just in Chicago, where the incidents had occurred. And by doing that, they gained a lot of trust that this company really does care about my health. They also reintroduced that product with a safety seal, which brought a lot of people to the Tylenol fold who had been using competing products before that. When the competition realized that they had to come out with safety seals too, a lot of people were now loyal Tylenol customers. So this was an unexpected crisis that they were able to survive and actually thrive after, based on that adherence to the values that they had been telling everybody were at the core of their business all along. So I maintain that a crisis is something that you are not expecting. It's a category of an emergency that you're not prepared for. Now, we have this conundrum that we're dealing with crises these days. First of all, nothing has really changed in crisis management since I first started practicing crisis management in the 1980s as director of corporate communications at Mattel, the toy company. You can imagine all kinds of product crises emerging when you're dealing with products aimed at children. It's the same set of principles that I was taught by people that I studied under that exist today. And yet, on the other hand, absolutely everything has changed about crisis communication because of the internet. And the primary thing that has changed, as you'll see when we get there, is the speed with which crises occur. You no longer have the luxury of time to craft a response. The time that you spend crafting that response is time that secondary and tertiary sources are filling the void with inaccurate information. And these could be people who are looking to make hay based on your troubles. So the solution is really to apply crisis fundamentals to a social real-time world. And I want to spend just a little bit of time going over those fundamentals if this is something that you haven't had an opportunity to study or deal with in the past. And the first of these is to recognize that the public is risk-averse. The public comes at a crisis feeling scared or terrified or nervous or angry or mistrustful because your organization has put them or people they care about at risk. What this means is that their reaction is emotional. And when they are reacting emotionally, responding with logic tends to look very, very defensive. It doesn't mean that you can't present the facts, but you have to recognize and communicate from this context of a public that is reacting emotionally based on a perceived risk, whether it's an actual risk or only a risk that they think they might be experiencing. It's still an emotion that they are bringing to this table. The public doesn't place a lot of credibility on the advocates for your business. The traditional spokespeople in a crisis tend to be a CEO or a public relations manager. I would urge you to go online when you get a chance to the Edelman Trust Barometer. Edelman Public Relations, one of the largest public relations agencies in the world, does an annual study involving hundreds of thousands of people from around the world, and they have determined that the CEO and the paid spokesperson for the organization are the least credible. They're the ones that the public attaches the least credibility to. Who is most credible? Well, first of all, there are third-party outside experts. So if you have relationships with academics or business analysts and the like, they're very, very credible. Next are subject matter experts and technical experts in your own organization, which is why I urge those people to get trained in social media and to turn them loose when a crisis happens so they can participate in the communities that are talking about this and present the information, present the facts that people need in order to understand your perspective on whatever it is that is going on. And third is the frontline employee. A regular employee, what the Edelman study refers to as someone like myself, is the most credible, third most credible spokesperson that you can look at during a crisis. So again, having those people trained, giving them social media access so that they can participate in a crisis may seem counterintuitive, but is actually the most effective thing to do. Media's role is based on conflict. I don't care how good your relationship is with a reporter or a newspaper. They're trying to sell newspapers. They're trying to draw eyeballs to a website. They're trying to get people to watch their edition of the evening news. It's all about selling advertising. Anybody who has worked in media relations has heard the old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. And they will exploit your crisis in order to draw eyeballs to their media channel. So will advocacy groups. If there are people who are opposed to your products and your services, they are going to leap on your crisis to their own advantages. And finally, crises are characterized by symbols. So let me ask you a quick question. If you kind of close your eyes for a minute and I draw your mind to the Exxon Valdez crisis, what image pops into your mind? Dead birds, yeah, floating in the water, the oil-soaked birds in the oil-stained water on the shores of the Puget Sound. That image is seared in our minds, in our memories. It is the symbol that has made itself so memorable from that particular crisis. If I ask you to do the same exercise around the Ford Explorer Firestone tire crisis, what image comes to mind? Yeah, a vehicle on the freeway, flipped over, emergency vehicles all around it, lights flashing. That's the image. We even do this around crises that don't have a physical component. There's some image that you can lock onto. The Enron disaster, for example. Most people picture employees leaving the building with all of their possessions in a box, looking like deer in the headlights, passing that big tilted E logo that was covered in Christmas lights as they left their jobs only a week earlier, thinking that they were working for one of the most successful new economy organizations in the country. So those are some of the basics. What we have to do in communicating with a crisis is first of all respond quickly. And these days quickly means usually within 30 minutes of your finding out that the crisis exists. And that reaction can be something as simple as, we know that this is happening, we're looking into it, we'll be back to you in a little bit with what we learn. But not saying anything isn't an option anymore. They know you know, and the longer you wait, the more suspicious you look. Not just quickly, but accurately, professionally, and carefully. We need to be transparent, and we need to be accessible. A lot of executives during a crisis will tend to close themselves in their office and be less visible than they normally are, when in fact this is a time when you have to be more visible, representing your organization. We have to treat perceptions as fact. That doesn't mean they are fact, that doesn't mean we say they're fact, but we have to acknowledge that the people who are watching this crisis may believe that they are fact. And as we respond, we have to address the crisis from that context, from understanding that these people believe that this is the truth of the crisis. Now here's the real tough one. We have to acknowledge a mistake if we have made one. Now, many of you probably have general counsels in your organization who will tell you not to do that. They say, keep your mouths quiet and we will deal with this in court. In fact, that's the worst advice that you can possibly get. There was a study that was conducted about 10 years ago out of Oxford. And the study looked at public companies and it checked their share prices the day before they had a crisis. Then the day of the crisis, they looked at the closing share price. And then at the end of the fiscal year, they looked at the share price. And what they found was that the ones that had admitted to mistakes and apologized had less of a decline in their share price on the day of the crisis and had not only recovered by the end of the fiscal year, but their stock price was actually higher than it was the day before the crisis. While those that implemented what an acquaintance of mine, an attorney who speaks on this issue, calls the 3 Ds, delay, deflect, defend, don't say anything, certainly don't admit anything. What these organizations found is that their share prices plummeted the day of the crisis, and by the end of the fiscal year, they had not recovered to the share price from the day before the crisis struck them. There are a lot of other studies that I could cite that point to the wisdom of simply laying your cards on the table and saying, here's what we did, here's what we're going to do to make sure that it never happens again. That addresses the risk that people feel your organization has put them at. Oh, they're going to take care of this, they're going to fix it, so it doesn't happen again. So acknowledge your mistakes as soon as you possibly can. Make sure that your message is being tailored to whoever feels aggrieved by whatever the nature of the crisis is, and make sure that you acknowledge the concerns of the other side. Anytime that you start to look a little arrogant, a little dismissive toward the concerns of the other side, that builds sympathy for the people who are feeling hurt by the crisis. A lot of times you'll see people get into public confrontations. The media tends to promote these a lot. You'll see situations, for example, 60 Minutes shows up at your office with the cameras rolling, and as a result of feeling defensive, you end up in an argument. That only makes you look guilty. And again, if you have existing relationships with academics, with doctors, with scientists, with anybody who can stand up as an external, objective third party and speak on your behalf, this is a time to call in those IOUs. There are other relationships that we have existing that we should start to tap into, and these mostly are our brand ambassadors, the people who love our products. Now the thing is that we have fans who love our products. Only about 4.5, 4.7% of our fans are actually brand ambassadors. That means only about 4.5% of the people who love our product are actively promoting it to their friends and their family, saying, you really should be using this. This is really interesting for us to consider because the data shows that people are very inclined to purchase what their friends are promoting. So we need to take action to convert the fans of our products into ambassadors. And there's a lot of literature out there about how to do that. But again, our frontline employees, our internal subject matter experts, and our external allies are forces to be brought to bear when a crisis occurs. So what are we dealing with modern crises? We have crises that erupt much faster than we have ever seen in the past. When I first started dealing with a crisis, I'd get a call from a reporter, and he would say, we're going on the air with this at 6 p.m., the 6 p.m. broadcast. we'd like to have a comment. I would say, okay, how soon do you need that comment? They would say 5:30 would be fine. And I'd be able to pull a team together and we could craft something. Those days are over and long gone. We have crises now that happen because somebody was on the scene when something happened and shot it with their smartphone and uploaded it to YouTube or to Facebook or to Twitter, where it was immediately shared by thousands of other people. And it's out there even before the media has knowledge that this thing has happened. So unprecedented speed. We also have an insatiable thirst for news. I heard somebody characterize it this way. They said, I previously had only seen this thirst for news inside the Beltway. And now it's everywhere. People are checking, saying, okay, the company said that in response. What are they saying now? Great, what are they saying now? And they're constantly going back to their phones or their tablets or their screens to see what the latest is. And of course, as I say, absolutely anyone can break news. Everybody is potentially a journalist on the scene of an incident because we all have the tools of journalistic reporting in our pockets these days. The boundaries between social and mainstream media are evaporating. The media are now using tweets and Facebook posts instead of calling people to get quotes. In fact, they're reporting now using Twitter and other social media tools. So exactly how quickly does news break? You probably remember this iconic image. This was shot by a fellow named Jonas Krum. He was just a guy on a ferry trying to get to Staten Island. And the ferry was diverted along with several others to pick the folks who were on the U.S. Airways flight off of the wing and off of the life rafts. And he pulled out his iPhone, he took a picture, he uploaded it to Twitter with a message saying something like, on our way to rescue these people. Crazy, huh? And you can imagine what happened as soon as his couple of hundred friends on Twitter saw that image. They retweeted it, and their friends retweeted it. The folks at U.S. Airways didn't know about this before hundreds of thousands of people on their phones and on their computers did. And they have a lot of channels that they can use in order to share information about this, like Wikipedia. The public relations agency Hill and Knowlton did this stop action video to show how quickly the entry that was created on this crisis was updated by the general public. They'd hear something on the radio, they'd find something online, go to Wikipedia, add an update. Somebody else would come in and edit and change and add and enhance. And over a couple of hours, hundreds of people had contributed to this article. Any crisis that erupts these days is going to find itself as a Wikipedia article. And you know what you can do about that? Exactly nothing. You are not allowed to, because you have a conflict of interest as a representative of the organization at the center of the crisis. You are, based on the rules of Wikipedia, not allowed to contribute to that article. So you have to address what people are reading there through other channels and have a plan and a process for doing that. So I'm not going to go through this entire video, but I want to do one of these quick exercises right now. To say that this is right now is a little disingenuous. This is just a few days ago, but I think it's probably still in your memory. Some of you may have been there. Anybody from Atlanta? Nobody's from Atlanta. Well, we had bad weather on the East Coast. Anybody going home to bad weather on the East Coast? Yeah. I've already heard from friends in Massachusetts about what it's like there. The governor didn't take the necessary actions in Georgia, in the major metropolitan areas when that weather hit, and it led to a lot of problems for commuters, for people trying to move around through the cities. And the first thing that the governor did when he was confronted with his inaction was he said it was an unexpected storm. Of course, the meteorologists had been out for some time saying this was going to be a really terrible storm and something needs to be done. Of all people, Al Roker got on the air and blasted the governor for risking the well-being of all of these folks in Georgia by not doing anything. It led to a lot of negative press. This photo of people sleeping on the floor of the grocery store got a lot of coverage, got shared a lot. The first time I saw it, somebody shared it on Facebook. So it really spread around. Ultimately led to an apology by the governor. So at your tables for just a couple of minutes, talk about, you're in the governor's office, you've gotten the warning that the storm is coming. What do you do? And what do you do if the governor decides not to take action and you're now faced with the kind of criticism that arose around that inaction? So just take a couple of minutes and we'll come back and hear what you think. And if you're sitting at a table by yourself, you can always move to another table. It's tough to have that kind of conversation by yourself, right? So who's got something you'd like to share? Who's got a thought around what you would have done if you'd been the media representative or the spokesperson of the governor's office? Apologize, yeah, immediately. There was an article in Business Week, it just came out yesterday or the day before, that said that the social media space is filled with apologies. And in fact, businesses are apologizing at a rate that is about 8.5 times more than individuals. And in customer service types of issues, it's at a rate that's about 35 times more than individuals. And the problem with most of them is that they don't seem real. They seem insincere. And an apology must be sincere if people are going to take it seriously. But if they do perceive that the apology is sincere, and you add to that an explanation about how you're going to keep this from happening again in the future, then people have an amazing capacity for forgiveness. A great example of this, you may remember 1997 at Kennedy Airport, JetBlue jets got frozen to the runway because as an ice storm hit, JetBlue decided to try to get their planes off the ground rather than go back to the terminals. And people were stuck on those planes for about 11 hours. They ran out of food. There was no heat. The toilets backed up after a while, and it was a real ugly experience. And there were a lot of angry passengers, not just the ones on the plane, but anybody who had booked a flight or was thinking of booking a flight on JetBlue. Dave Nealman, who was the CEO at the time, created a video that he uploaded to YouTube in which he apologized. And what was awesome about that video was that he wasn't reading from a script. He was talking from his heart. He had tears welled up in his eyes. This was the airline he had built from scratch, and he was mortified and devastated by what had happened. And he apologized, and then he outlined how he was going to make sure that this never happened again. They were short-staffed at the airport, but they were now going to be able to mobilize employees who were at home to immediately jump in and start helping with the decision-making and the reroutings and the like. And that crisis evaporated, and JetBlue continued to thrive after that because of a sincere apology that also included that addressing of the perceived risk for the future. Anybody have any other thoughts on this particular case? Sorry?
Call Saul.
Call Saul. Okay. So what is news exactly? I have a degree in journalism. I started my career as a newspaper reporter before making the move over to corporate communications. And I was taught that news was a major announcement, a major event, or a major milestone that affected people in the market in which that publication or channel did its business. That's not what news is anymore. News today is what's happening right now. Because people have access to so many channels, and people are using their smartphones now during what we refer to as previously unusable moments, standing in line at the grocery store. I swear the National Enquirer and the Star and the Globe and all of those are doomed, because when you're standing at the checkout counter, you're no longer looking at that impulse item, you're doing this. on your phone. And what are you flipping through? You're flipping through Facebook, you're flipping through Flipboard, you're reading news and links that people are sharing, you're on Twitter, and people are just insatiable with this thirst that they have for information. If there is a news cycle these days, it is a 140-character news cycle. That's about the amount of time that you have to respond. And you have about 6 seconds once somebody sees your response to capture their attention and get them to actually absorb the information that you're sharing. So you have to be fairly adept at conveying information quickly. There are organizations now that are using tools like Vine videos to address this. NatWest, which is a bank out of the UK, has assembled a bunch of Vine videos that answer routine customer service questions. And when somebody poses that question over Twitter, they share the Vine video. In 6 seconds, they get an answer to the question. There's quite a lot of storytelling, it turns out, that you can do in 6 seconds. But this is the news cycle today, according to the public relations agency Burson Marsteller. The news breaks, it gets spread, it's amplified by the mainstream media. Those reports are then amplified by social media, and it just continues in this vicious cycle. So we need to start embracing social media in our response to a crisis. First of all, it's where people go. A study out of the University of Colorado at Boulder concluded that during the critical event period of a crisis, which could be the first hour, could be the first 6 hours, it could be the first day, it depends on the nature of the crisis, they're not looking for the media to cover this, they're looking for people who are there, or people who know people who are there to inform them about what's going on. The cornerstone of this study was a review of the Virginia Tech shooting. And where people went for information was to the Facebook and Twitter accounts of students and faculty and staff at Virginia Tech, their parents, their friends, their siblings, because they had that on-the-ground view of what was happening right there. We can also update instantly with social media. There was a fascinating case a few years ago where one of the unions that worked with United Airlines bought the domain using the CEO's name. I don't remember his name, but it was hisname.com, and they used this to create a site that attacked the organization. And they went through legal channels to try to remove it, which took quite a long time. If they had dealt with that through the social media channels that they had, they might have been able to get the word out much more quickly that, hey, this actually isn't our site, which is what it was designed to do, was to fool people into thinking it was an official site. It gives us a human voice that we can use to respond to a crisis. If there's anything that turns people off where there is an appearance, a belief that people are harmed, people are suffering, it's being clinical and really cold and corporate in the response. And through social channels, it's much easier for people to talk with that more warm and real human voice. Social media also produces a record. You can always go back and point to that tweet that you sent and say, yes, we did address that. It's right there in the Twitter stream. It's right there in the date and time that the video was uploaded to YouTube, whatever channels you are using. And by the way, engaging in the conversation through social media heightens the credibility of your response. It's not something we're accustomed to in crisis management, but more and more organizations are figuring this out. I happen to believe that a blog should be at the center of online social media responses because, well, first of all, the media pay attention to them. Southwest Airlines has a wonderful blog. If you've never seen Nuts About Southwest, it's written by about 50 volunteer employees who have gone through training, but when the organization has a crisis, Gary Kelly, the CEO, will take to that blog to address the crisis, and it has a built-in readership. The media knows it's there. In fact, the media covers it very, very closely, and the blog can actually become the center of your crisis communication. If you've tweeted something, if you have uploaded a video to YouTube, all of those can be aggregated in the blog as the one-stop shop that people can go to see everything that you're saying. Your critical publics are also following your blogs, and they do serve as that hub in the hub and spoke model of communication. This is Michael Hyatt. He's the CEO of a publisher, Thomas Nelson Publishers, recently retired CEO. And he had a crisis on his hands when Publishers Weekly on its front page ran an article claiming that his organization was requiring authors in the non-religious categories to sign on to religious principles as they wrote their book. And this was seen as very outrageous by a lot of readers of Publishers Weekly. He told me in an interview I did with him that he could have called Publishers Weekly, explained why this was wrong, and demanded a retraction, which would have run in the next week's issue, which would have left a week of people reading this information and not seeing that it wasn't true. Instead, he took to his blog, which he said is read by twice the number of people who subscribe to Publishers Weekly, and the issue died in about 20 minutes. Another great example of a blog being used for crisis communication was from the Transportation Security Administration. One mommy blogger proclaimed in her blog that the TSA separated her from her infant during a screening, and that produced tremendous outrage in the public. On the TSA blog, cleverly titled The TSA Blog, blogger Bob, who is their principal blogger, who is a former transportation security officer, wrote that he had two reactions to this. One, as a parent, he was certainly sympathetic, but two, as a former TSO, he knew that it couldn't be true. They're not allowed to separate a child from their parent under any circumstance. And to prove it, he uploaded a video of the security cameras at Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport. Now, a lot of people said, how do you know, first of all, that that was the mother that actually wrote the blog post? The blogger came back and said, yes, it was me. But what they did in editing these different views is create the perception that I wasn't separated from my child, when in fact I was, and that's what you can do with editing. The TSA came back and said, okay, you want to see all 9 unedited security camera videos? Go for it. That made that crisis go away, that kind of transparency, that kind of immediate response through a blog that people were able to share. 55% of journalists worldwide are using Twitter, Facebook, and social media services in their reporting, both to gather resources, to gather information, and to share information. So it is important that we be there in these channels and understand how to use each of them appropriately. This is a discussion forum called therangerstation.com. It was set up by a guy who loves his Ford Ranger pickup truck. And Ford Motor Company sent him a letter. It was a cease and desist. They said, take down that site and turn the domain over to Ford and pay us $5,000, or we will come at you with the full force of the legal department of the Ford Motor Company. The guy was terrified and startled and shocked, and said so in a post that he ran on the homepage of the site, basically looking for advice from his followers, the people who participated in this forum. What should I do? What they did, those friends and fans and followers, was first of all take down Ford's customer service line by flooding it with calls, and then they took to social media. Scott Monty, who runs social media at Ford, awakened that morning to a lot of tweets from people who knew him, telling him he had a crisis on his hand. So Scott started tweeting. Scott tweeted things like, I am on the phone with the legal department. I am on my way to a meeting with the legal department. I just got to the meeting with the legal department. He actually is the first public relations representative in history, agency or corporate, to ask for a retweet. He said, for anyone asking about the Ford fan sites and legal action, I'm in active discussions with our legal department. And when the whole thing was resolved, he tweeted that too, along with a link to where you could go get the statement from both Ford and the owner of the site. Over the course of about 12 hours, he tweeted 138 times to 32,000 followers, far more through retweeting. What that did was it kept anybody from speculating or reporting. They simply waited to see what Scott was going to say next. And when the whole thing was resolved, they all said, there's no story here. And it ended up not getting reported by the auto press the auto blogs, the big ones like Jalopnik and Cars.com, or by the mainstream media. So let's take a look at another one of these that might hit a little closer to home for all of you out there. This is a company called Zoox. I don't know if you've heard of Zoox, but they make pet food that people love because it is very pure and organic, and it turned out that they were acquired by Purina. And that led a lot of their fans to take to the Zoox Facebook page and express their displeasure at this turn of events. Just read this horrible news: money grab at our pets' expense. Why would Purina allow you to say the same? I'm not buying it. This is what a lot of people said. I am no longer going to buy your product now that you are part of Purina. So again, at your tables, what would you do? Just about 2 minutes. How would you respond to that? So it's easy to see the analogy here to the business you're in. If somebody feels that the purity of your product is threatened, for whatever reason, they're going to take to whatever channels are available to them to express their displeasure, to tell you that they're not going to buy your product. And by the way, if somebody says, I'm not going to buy your product, their friends, their family, their peers are influenced by that and will be predisposed to not buy your product as well. So what do you do when this happens on your site?
I think we saw a lot of this happen. This is similar to a lot of stories that we saw already in the natural products industry, with some smaller brands being purchased by some corporate parents. And you saw a lot of the same thing happen, that people were very worried about what was going to happen under this new leadership. And I think in a lot of those cases, you saw the CEO of the purchased company, and my example is Honest Tea being purchased by Coca-Cola, and people saying to Seth Goldman that you've sold out. And he's saying, no, I have a good story, I have a good message, and I just want to be able to share it with a larger audience. And we had the conversation that it's also a matter of, once the corporate parent sees this on the social media channel, it's making them pay attention to the fact that they really do have to keep the heritage of the original brand.
The problem I have with that as a reaction is that the CEO is not a very credible source when speaking about that. I think it's right to tell the story. And storytelling is something that we have to get much better at. We have to show rather than tell. But we have to have somebody else do it besides the CEO, whether it's the acquiring CEO or the acquired CEO. Who would tell that story? Yeah.
People who work for Zoox. People who work for Zoox while their dog or cat is sitting with them, talking about how much they love their dog and cat, and how likely they have an equity stake in the business. And they made this decision as an owner of the business because they wanted to bring that message and those fine products to more people.
I think it's a brilliant, it actually hadn't occurred to me to have employees with pets of the organization say, I'm going to keep feeding this to my pet because I know what this acquisition is all about, and I know that our product is going to remain pure. That's why I'm staying with the company as well. So I think that's a very powerful message to have those employees involved. Also with subject matter experts, with both the acquiring and the acquired company, for the people who are responsible for ingredients and processes for manufacturing and purity, to talk about the fact that the whole reason we want this company is to make a product available to the segment of the market for whom this is really, really important. So I think those are good answers. Let's talk for just a few minutes specifically about crises that erupt in social media, because your role in these crises is to be a first responder, understanding that you are dealing with an angry public. I've already told you about the JetBlue incident and Dave Nealman's brilliant video response, but you know what he didn't do? JetBlue had a blog, and they didn't address it on the blog, and that left people with no place to go to complain and ask questions. So this was a passenger on one of the planes who started her own blog. And because it was her blog, and she publicized it well, she knew how to use the social media tools available to her to build awareness of this, that a lot of passengers and a lot of other people who were concerned started posting and started leaving comments and questions. It was hers. She controlled it, which meant that if anybody from JetBlue tried to post anything, she deleted it. She said, you've got your channels, I've got mine. You're not welcome. So this became a forum that JetBlue was not allowed to participate in. So you have to open your channels. I've seen a lot of crises erupt where the company closes off commenting and posting to Facebook. That's a huge mistake. People see that and they know that you're censoring those comments, that you are shutting down conversation. And if you think that's going to keep the conversation from happening, guess again, they're just going to go someplace else. There are too many avenues available for people to simply throw up their hands and say, well, they've closed it on their Facebook page, so guess I'll just be quiet now. They'll find other channels. They can create their own Facebook pages to deal with this. If we want our messages to get spread around, we have to release those messages into the wild. We have to make them shareable. That means getting things up onto YouTube where people can use the embed code. Southwest Airlines had an incident where they threw a family off the plane. It was not while they were flying. It was on the ground where they were connecting. The kids had been so unruly. The parents were doing nothing about it. They said, we're not going to allow you onto your connecting flight. This created a huge uproar. It stranded a family in a city. So the head of public relations shot a 2-minute video addressing the situation from Southwest perspective, why this action was taken, what we're going to do for the family, and what we're going to do about this in a policy setting for the future. And they uploaded it to YouTube, and it found its way onto dozens of popular travel and airline blogs, which meant more people would have seen it than if it only sat there on JetBlue's site. You could do the same with images these days. Instagram is a phenomenal tool for spreading images around. So is Twitter. We have SlideShare if we want to get a lot of facts out to people. Those are embeddable. Scribd for documents. There are a lot of tools out there that make it easy for people to share your content. The more your content is shared, the more control you retain over the message, as opposed to letting people create their own content from their own perspective because they don't have access to your materials. We have to learn to respond well. And as far as I'm concerned, the only way we do this is by drilling a crisis. I think having a crisis plan is fine, but we have to start drilling our responses to those crises. You may have seen this on 9/11. AT&T deployed this image in tribute to the victims of 9/11, and the reaction was they're using this to sell their phones. That's terrible. They issued this response. We apologize to anyone who felt our post was in poor taste. The image was solely meant to pay respect. It seems so disingenuous, like it was written by a committee of legal and executive representatives, and it was slammed worse than the original image was, which led the chairman to have to write a blog post to finally put the issue somewhat to rest. We have to be sincere in our responses and human and abide by those principles that I gave you at the beginning, understanding that people are coming at this emotionally and they believe the facts that have been presented to them, even if they're wrong. We have to be authentic. And you know what? Being authentic means that you don't necessarily have to be slick. There was an incident a couple of years ago with General Motors where a memo leaked in which the organization seemed to be saying employees are no longer allowed to call Chevrolet vehicles Chevy. We have to use the word Chevrolet. And because this leaked, people were just, a lot of people were amused, but a lot of people were outraged, and it started to spread through wildfire. So a member of the GM social media team grabbed his little flip phone video tool, and he ran over to the office of the executive who issued the memo. Now, GM produces TV commercials. You see their commercials all the time. You want to talk about an organization that knows how to be slick and professional and highly produced. General Motors is near the top of that list. Here's the video they released around this crisis.
Hey guys, it's GM Joe sitting here in General Motors global headquarters in gorgeous downtown Detroit. And we've been pretty busy today talking about the discussion of Chevy versus Chevrolet. So we have Alan Beatty here, and he's going to talk to us about this. Alan Beatty is the Vice President of Sales and Service for Chevrolet. So Alan, My fingers are a little tired right now, actually, from tweeting on my BlackBerry about this Chevy versus Chevrolet discussion. Tell me what's going on. Can we use Chevy as GM employees?
Okay, of course we can. Chevy, what is Chevy? Chevy's our nickname. And where does it come from? It's come from selling vehicles here in the US for 100 years. We love it when people call us Chevy. It means that they're very attached to us, they're very close to us, and we're like a friend. So they use our nickname Chevy. There's nothing wrong with that at all, and we love that. In fact, we love people talking to us in that way.
So then what's going on? What was this memo that said we need to start using Chevrolet instead of Chevy?
Okay, let's put it into context. Chevrolet is one of the fastest growing brands in the world today. We're selling now in over 130 countries. For every vehicle we sell here in the US, we're actually selling 2 vehicles overseas. So we really are on a great momentum and a great march. But it's also true to say that Chevrolet is at an early stage of development in many of these markets. So the ability for us to use our Chevrolet brand name, as we do on all of our vehicles, in all of our dealerships in all of those countries, just gives us the ability in this global world we live in today to get the maximum amount of leverage. And that's really all it's about. And you know what I hope in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, in all of these countries, they're talking about Chevy as our nickname, because what does that mean? It means we're close to them as we are here in the US. And it's just a great place to be. So, you know, Chevy's a great nickname, and we love it. And I don't want to distract from that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Woefully underproduced, but very sincere, very authentic. I don't think anybody would doubt Mr. Beatty's sincerity in that video. Unscripted, speaking from the heart, it did put an end to that particular crisis. We have a lot of tools available to us. This is a Storify story a student used. He had an apartment overlooking the park where the Occupy protesters were in Washington, D.C. The press was not there when the police evacuated the park, so he started curating tweets on the ground, videos that were uploaded to YouTube and the like. The Washington Post, having no reporter on the ground to cover this, simply used the embed code in this story and ran it on the homepage of the Washington Post as their coverage. You can use Storify to curate responses to your crisis that can provide an objective view of what people are saying and what the reactions are, and throw that out there into the media mix. We have to leverage those existing relationships. When Domino's had its crisis around those kids who were doing disgusting things with food that they videotaped and put up on YouTube, they actually didn't have any social media except for 250,000 followers on Facebook. They turned to Facebook to say, if you know who these idiots are, would you let us know what store they work in? Somebody did, and they were arrested and are doing time today. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it. That's what Epicurious did when they tried to use the Boston Marathon bombing to direct people to recipes on their sites. They said, our food tweets this morning were frankly insensitive. Our deepest sincere apologies. Did a lot to correct that situation. If you can, change the conversation. And that's what happened with Pampers when they introduced a new line of diapers that seemed to produce more diaper rash. One mommy blogger was all over that. They decided to, rather than defend the diaper, to initiate conversation about diaper rash. People joined in that, and the conversation about that particular brand evaporated. If you can use humor, and you have to be very cautious about using humor, there are instances where you can. This was an instance on Facebook. This is a feminine hygiene product out of the UK, and this guy kind of took issue with the fact that the company was making it look like people can, that women during their period are able to go out horseback riding and bicycling and the like. And they responded with a hysterical video of the CEO confessing that you really can't do all of that. It got a lot of views. It got a lot of positive praise for taking that approach to this, but they had to do something when 3,500 people were commenting on this post to their Facebook page. We're out of time, actually, for this last exercise. I'll share it with you, though, very quickly. This is Scarlett Johansson. You probably saw her on the Super Bowl. She is the new spokesperson for a company called SodaStream. SodaStream allows you to make your own carbonated sodas and not have to go to the expense of buying Coke and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper products and the like. The problem with this is that people were kind of upset when it was revealed that SodaStream is an Israeli company with a plant in the occupied Palestinian territories. They did some really interesting things here. First of all, they changed the conversation to the fact that the Fox network, which broadcasts the Super Bowl, wouldn't let them end the commercial with "Sorry, Coke and Pepsi." They posted the original video, and a lot of people started talking about that. Even mainstream media started talking about the fact that you could go watch the uncensored video. You also had Scarlett Johansson, who had been a spokesperson for the activist group Oxfam, an ambassador for them, sever her relationship with Oxfam rather than SodaStream. She rejected the criticism that was leveled at her based on the fact that the Palestinian workers loved their jobs, and there was a lot of evidence to suggest that the income that they were generating on this at this plant was actually stimulating the economy in the occupied territories. So, as I said, we don't have time to address this. I just want to leave you with what I believe is the most important thing you can do, and that is to activate your employees. They are all online. Many of them have listed the name of their employers in their profiles. They're going to be asked questions when your crisis hits the news. So keep them informed. When a crisis hits, make sure they know what you're going out and telling the public and what the facts are, where they can go get information that they can share in order to answer the questions that they're going to get hit with. Reiterate what your social media policies are. Activate any ambassador groups that you may have developed. A lot of organizations are developing employee ambassador teams designed to help promote the organization, its products, its services, its corporate social responsibility agenda, and activate your subject matter experts so they can get out there into those expert communities and start addressing the issues from that level of highly credible, highly trusted expertise. I'll be back in a little bit on the panel for Q&A, but thank you for your attention.